Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matthew Taylor. I'm Chief Executive of the RSA. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's very special RSA Commencement event. The curators of our events programme have decided that one can never be too long in the tooth to hear some valuable life lessons. So they've revamped and reworked the US-style commencement address for audiences of all ages. So whilst you won't be walking out of this lecture hall clutching mortarboard and diploma today, you will, however, be the proud recipient of some pearls of wisdom to help you navigate your way through life. Can you do whatever you have to do to your mobile phone to make it silent, but don't turn it off because you should tweet about the event on hashtag RSA Commencement. Also, just to say, as I always do, that you can watch this event again or share it with friends. It'll be on our website in a few days' time. And also, we're live streaming to our online audience. So hello to our online viewers and listeners. So, housekeeping notice is over. I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming Cheryl Strayed, who has kindly agreed to deliver this inaugural address. This could be a very long and very big series, and then, you know, we have an archive, and so when you do something like this, it'll be remembered forever that you were the very first person to do it. As many of you know, Cheryl is a best-selling, hugely acclaimed author, memoirist and essayist and columnist. Her New York Times bestseller, Wild, which tells the story of her solo hike across the Pacific Crest Trail after the dissolution of her marriage and the sudden death of her mother, was chosen by Oprah Winfrey as her first selection for her relaunch book club 2.0. A film adaptation of the book is being made. How exciting is this? A film adaptation of the book is being made as we speak, with a screenplay by Nick Hornby and Reese Witherspoon in the lead role as Cheryl herself. She's also the author of the celebrated novel Torch and Tiny Beautiful Things, a collection of the phenomenally popular and powerful Dear Sugar columns from the Rumpus website. So having candidly and kindly guided her readers through the ups and downs of life, we couldn't have a better guide for today's discussion. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Cheryl Strayed.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming on this rainy afternoon. I have a feeling you have a lot of rainy afternoons here in London. Yes. Thank you for coming out. I'm so excited to get to read a commencement address to you. I've always been a fan of that form. Commencement addresses are a call to action. They're a reflection. They're a celebration of an achievement, you know, given usually at this very momentous time in a person's life. And I think more than anything, what they are is really a lecture of advice, a letter of advice. And it's the kind of advice that most interests me. It's not the sort of advice where somebody is being instructed or told what to do, but rather it's advice of the Spirit. It's not how, you know, what should you do, but it's how should you live? How should you be? And it asks deeper questions. It encourages the listener or the recipient of that address to reach wider and love more deeply and think more in a more complex way. And so I think that that's why so many of us, when we, you know, those commencement speeches, especially I think in the last few years, some of those that have gone viral online, that we're inspired by them even though we ourselves aren't at that moment. We're not graduating from university on that day. And so it's in that spirit I'm going to read to you a commencement address that I wrote in my capacity as Dear Sugar, which you all call an agony aunt here in Great Britain. And I got this job as Sugar a few years ago, actually in 2010, and it became this thing. When I first took it on, I thought, well, who am I to give advice? And the answer was no one. And then I realized that actually that the advice, you know, the advice form, like the commencement address, allowed me to do that very thing I just spoke of, give advice of the Spirit, take a question and make it more universal. And so in writing the column, I got all kinds of questions about all kinds of things. And one of them was from a professor at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And he was a creative writing and English professor. And he said, he and his class wrote to me, he said, look, I have all of these students who are about to graduate with majors in English, and everyone around them, the culture, their parents, everyone is saying, what the hell are you going to do with an English degree? What kind of job are you going to get? How practical is that? And he said, what can you tell them that will make them not despair? Many people were suggesting that they go immediately to law school instead of pursuing their interests in English literature. And so I'm going to read the answer I gave to his class. It is addressed to students who are English majors, but the cool thing about, I think, this kind of address is that it has relevance to all of us over the course of our lives. That it's that time that you step out of university and into the real world is obviously one, fraught with all kinds of transitions and changes and beginnings and endings. But, I'm 45 now, and many of you, it looks in the room, have also commenced, like I have. You know that you have to do that over and over again throughout your life. So let me just read to you this letter I wrote in response to the professor's letter, addressing his class of students. There's a line by the Italian writer Carlo Levi that I think is apt at this moment in your life. The future has an ancient heart. I love it because it expresses with such grace and economy what is certainly true, that who we become is born of who we most primitively are, that we both know and cannot possibly know what it is we've yet to make manifest in our lives. I think it's a useful sentiment for you to reflect upon now at this time, when the future likely feels the opposite of ancient, when instead it feels like a Lamborghini that's pulled up to the curb while every voice around demands you get in and drive. I'm here to tell you it's okay to travel by foot. In fact, I recommend it. Those who've read Wild know I really recommend it. There's so much ahead that's worth seeing, so much behind you can't identify at top speed. Your professor is correct. You're going to be all right. And you're going to be all right not because you majored in English or didn't, and not because you plan to apply to law school or don't, but because all right is almost always where we eventually land, even if we mess up entirely along the way. I know. I messed up some things. I was an English major too, as it happens. I lied for 6 years about having my English degree, though I didn't exactly mean to lie. I had, in truth, gone to college and participated in a graduation ceremony. I'd walked across the stage and collected a paper baton. On that paper, it said a bachelor's degree would be mine once I finished one final class. Technically, it wasn't even a class I needed to finish. It was a 5-page paper on a short story called The Nose by Nikolai Gogol. It seemed like such an easy thing to do to write that paper, but it wasn't. And so I didn't, and the years slipped past, each one making it seem more unlikely that I'd ever get my degree. I'd done all the coursework except that one class. I'd gotten good grades. To claim I had a degree in English was truer than not, I told myself. But that didn't make it true. You have to do what you have to do. You can't go to law school if you don't have any interest in being a lawyer. Faking it never, ever works. If you don't believe me, read Richard Wright. Read Charlotte Bronte. Read Joy Harjo. Read William Trevor. Read the entire Western canon. Or just close your eyes and remember everything you already know. Let whatever mysterious starlight that guided you this far guide you onward into whatever crazy beauty awaits. Trust that all you learned during your college years was worth learning, no matter what answer you have or do not have about what use it is. Know that all those stories and poems and plays and novels are a part of you now, and that they're bigger than you, and they always will be. I was a waitress during most of the years that I didn't have my English degree. My mother had been a waitress for many of the years that she was raising my siblings and me. She loved to read. She always wanted to go to college. One time she took a night class when I was very young, and my father became enraged with her and cut her textbook into tiny pieces with a pair of scissors. She dropped the class. I think it was biology. You don't have to get a job that makes others feel comfortable about what they perceive as your success. You don't have to explain what you plan to do with your life. You don't have to justify your education by demonstrating its financial rewards. You don't have to maintain an impeccable credit score. Anyone who expects you to do any of those things has no sense of history or economics or science or the arts. You have to pay your own electric bill. You have to be kind. You have to give it all you got. You have to find people who love you truly and love them back with the same truth. But that's all. I got married when I was in college. I got divorced during the years that I was lying about having my English degree. When I met the man to whom I'm now married, he said, "You know, I really think you should finish your degree. Not because I want you to, but I can tell that you want to." I thought he was sort of being an asshole. We didn't bring up the subject again for a year. I understand what you're afraid of. I understand what your parents fear. There are practical concerns. One needs money to live. And there is the deep longing to feel legitimate in the world, to feel that others hold us in regard. I felt intermittently ashamed during my years as a waitress. I'm the only one of my siblings who went to college. I was supposed to be the one who made it. At times it seemed instead I'd squandered my education and dishonored my dead mother by becoming a waitress like her. Sometimes I would think of this as I went from table to table with my tray, and I'd have to think of something else so I wouldn't cry. Years after I no longer worked at the last restaurant where I waited tables, my first novel was published. The man who'd been my manager at the restaurant read about me in the newspaper and came to my reading. He'd been a pretty awful boss. In fact, at times I despised him, but I was touched to see him in the bookstore that night. All those years ago, who would have ever guessed we'd be here celebrating the publication of your novel? He asked me when we embraced. I would have, I replied. And it was true. I always would have guessed it, even all the time that I feared it would never happen. Being there that night with my first published novel was the meaning of my life. Getting there had been my every intention. When I say you don't have to explain what you're going to do with your life, I'm not suggesting you lounge around whining about how difficult it is. I'm suggesting you apply yourself in directions for which we have no accurate measurement. I'm talking about work and love. It's really condescending to tell you how young you are. It's even inaccurate. Some of you who are graduating from college are not young. Some of you are older than me. But to those of you new college graduates who are indeed young, the old new college graduates will back me up on this. You're so goddamn young. Which means about 8 of the 10 things you've decided about yourself will over time prove to be false. The other 2 things will prove to be so true that you'll look back in 20 years and howl. My mother was young too, but not like those of you who are so goddamned young. She was 40 when she finally went to college. She spent the last years of her life as a college student, though she didn't know they were her last years. She thought she was at the beginning of the next era of her life. She died a couple of months before we were both supposed to graduate from different schools. At her memorial service, my mother's favorite professor stood up and granted her a PhD. The most terrible and beautiful and interesting things happen in a life. For some of you, those things have already happened. Whatever happens to you belongs to you. Make it yours. Feed it to yourself, even if it feels impossible to swallow. Let it nurture you, because it will. I've learned this over and over and over again. There came a day when I decided to stop lying. I called the college from which I did not have an English degree and asked the woman who answered the phone what I needed to do to get one. She told me I had only to take one class. It could be any class. I chose Latin. I'd never studied Latin, but I wanted to know at last. where so many of our words come from. I had a romantic idea of what it would be like to study Latin. The Romance languages, after all, descended from it. But studying Latin was not romantic. It was a lot of confusion and memorization and attempting to decipher bizarre stories about soldiers marching around ancient lands. In spite of my best efforts, I got a B. One thing I never forgot from my Latin class is that a language that is descended from another language is called a daughter language. It was the beginning of the next era of my life, like this is yours. Years after I no longer lived in the state where my mother and I went to college, my first novel was published, and I traveled to that state to give a reading. Just as my former awful boss had done in a different city mere weeks before, the professor who granted my mother a PhD at her memorial service read about me in the newspaper and came to the bookstore to hear me read. All those years ago, who would have ever guessed we'd be here celebrating the publication of your first novel, she asked when we embraced. Not me, I replied, not me. And it was true. I meant it as sincerely as I'd meant that I always would have guessed it when I'd been speaking to my boss. That both things could be true at once. My disbelief, as well as my certainty, was the unification of the ancient and the future parts of me. It was everything I intended, and yet still I was surprised by what I got. I hope you'll be surprised in knowing at once. I hope you'll always have love. I hope you'll have days of ease and a good sense of humor. I hope when people ask what you're going to do with your English or creative writing degree, you'll say, continue my bookish examination of the contradictions and complexities of human motivation and desire. Or maybe just carry it with me as I do everything that matters. And then smile very serenely until they say, oh. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. That was great, and I'm sure there'll be many questions from our audience. But I'll just start off by asking you a couple of questions.
Sure.
The first is there a piece of advice that you've heard from somebody else, possibly at a commencement lecture or something else, something like that, which has been powerful for you in your life?
So many things, and I find that, and you're going to ask me which ones now. I think that so much of the advice I've given as sugar, or the advice I just gave in my own commencement address, or any of the good things in my life, in some ways are, handed down over time. Just the same way that we get an education in the subject we study. I think we are also inspired by the people who came before us and shared their wisdom. And one of the things I heard in a commencement address that I just read, and it was by an American poet named Adrienne Rich, who I just revere. She has always really talked about in her work and written out of a place of her wounds and her sorrows and made that into something beautiful. And I find that to be very inspiring.
Now, giving people advice or guidance is a brave thing to do. And sometimes you can get it wrong. So I'm interested today, but also in your column, what are the kind of challenges for you, the ethical challenges for you in terms of believing that you are in a position to give other people advice?
Well, I think that it has to do with repositioning that position. I never, ever, ever say I'm coming from a place of authority. Right. I really try to always establish the fact that I'm just right down there in the muck with whoever's writing to me. I mean, just in the piece I read, which is a column called The Future Has an Ancient Heart. And by way of sharing what I have to offer to these graduates, I'm also telling them, look, when I graduated, I didn't even graduate. I couldn't finish a paper. It took me years to go back and do that. And so that's in some ways really saying, I'm not an authority. I don't think that we necessarily have to get advice from people who have positions of authority. Who do we ask for advice? Our friends, our parents, strangers on the street sometimes therapists, And so I think that we're all getting a range of information from a number of sources, and as Sugar, I'm simply one of those sources. Now, at the same time, I take my work as Sugar really very seriously, and so I would never just quickly dash off a response to somebody and tell them what to do. I usually do, rather than instructing them, I say, let's look at this question in a more complex way. And so instead of telling them what to do, I actually stretch out what they've even asked, and probably confuse them more.
Do people come back to you afterwards and say,
yeah.
I followed it up and it all went really well? And do they ever come back and say, I followed it up and it was a complete disaster?
I've never had, so about a third of the people whose letters I've answered have been in touch with me, maybe a third to half. And not one of them has said, you are wrong and you ruined my life.
That's a good strike rate.
Some people have come back to me and said, well, I didn't tell you the whole story. Right. And then if they had told me, and then they of course tell me the rest of the story, and I would have said something slightly different in the column had I known, But usually I have so many wonderful stories from people actually who have just had better lives, in response to, in some ways, something I advised in the column, And I think too, it's not so much about what I write. I mean, I think the act of writing a letter to somebody when you're seeking help, when you really allow yourself to be vulnerable, just writing all of that stuff down is so helpful to people.
What would have happened? Was there anything that anybody could have said to you in the years when your life was going off track, after your mother died, before you went on the walk, when things were really all over the place for you? Was there anything that anybody could have said, or was this just something you had to get through?
That's a great question. I think probably not. I think that I think sometimes we have to have a hard time. When something difficult happens, when something life-changingly sad or painful happens, we suffer. And so, suffering was the natural response to my mother's death at 45. And so in the midst of that, I did things that were positive and things that were negative and good for me and things that were bad for me. And, I found my way through. But I would say one of the things that I feel most acutely when I look back and think, could anyone have helped me? I felt so alone. And I wasn't actually alone. I remember thinking, just even though rationally I knew other people's mothers had died, I didn't know anyone who had a dead mother. And I didn't know I could seek them out. And now what's interesting is, I'm like the captain of the club of the dead mothers, because everyone comes to me and says, oh my God, my mom's dead too. And there are so many people who relate to my experience because it's their experience too. And I think that if I could go back in time, that would have been something that maybe made a little bit of a difference.
But the walk that you went on, the amazing hike that you went on, that's the subject of the book and the film, this had an amazing kind of cathartic effect on you. For those people who feel their life has gone off track, that they are lost in some way or another, is there something they can do which is less demanding than than nearly killing themselves? Because you went out and you had too much stuff in your backpack.
I did.
You were pretty foolish, to be honest. You
probably
got through it, but
I'm still pretty foolish. Yeah.
But that's in a way that's the problem with this, is that you would never advise someone to set out like you set out, carrying far too much stuff and not really knowing what you were doing. But in a way, setting out not knowing what you were doing was part of what it was, which is this kind of paradoxical thing about advice, isn't it? That you kind of have to make the mistake to get there.
You do. That's it. I don't know if you're a parent, but it's this, you watch your children, you can tell them things, and there are things they have to learn on their own. And it's funny, because you're right, I was absolutely foolish and I took too much stuff. But that's the most common backpacker mistake in the book. Not in my book, in the book of life,
Right.
People come to me and say, I did the same thing the first. Very few people don't do the same thing the first time they go backpacking, because we don't know what it really means to carry everything you need on your back until there you are carrying everything you need on your back, and then you realize, okay, this is crazy. And and you learn by doing.
Is this a metaphor for baggage more generally?
It is. And so you learn to lighten your load, and just like you learn how to heal a broken heart, or you learn all of these things over time by doing them. And so I think it was as it had to be. I do think, back to your original question, what can people do who are in the midst of some sort of strife or struggle or suffering? It doesn't have to be hiking. What it was for me, if you really, take the core intention, essentially, of my PCT journey, it was, how do I, get myself out of this place where I'm doing all these things that are causing me to suffer more, and get myself into a place, like physically, literally, into a place where I have the opportunity to feel good again, to feel strong again. And my mother, one of the things that just absolutely drove me insane about my mother is she was very optimistic. And, as a teenager, nobody appreciates an optimist, And so she'd say, look on the bright side, and, she would always be very much like this. And, after she died, one of the things that she would always say, before she died, she would always say, anytime you're really miserable, you have the opportunity to escape that to some extent. There's always a sunrise and there's always a sunset, and you can be there. You can be present for that beauty. You can put yourself in the way of beauty, and you can have that in your life. And I would just be like, oh, Mom, And then years passed, and she died, and there I was on the PCT. And every morning there was the most unbelievable sunrise, and every night the most unbelievable sunset. And I realized I had done what she told me to do. I had put myself in the way of beauty. And so I think, just trying to do that, even if it's the smallest thing, can be incredibly healing.
It's terrible, I think, just taking that particular point, how many young people now have virtually no chance ever to be away from devices, away from light,
and
away
old
from,
people too. We're all trapped by that thing.
Yeah. So just a couple more points before I bring the audience in. I just want to bounce a bit unfair, really, because it's quite a big question, but I want to kind of bounce off you 2 or 3 thoughts that I've heard or we've heard about. Which would chime with some of the points you made about life and how you approach life. So one is, we had Brené Brown speak here quite recently.
Oh, yeah.
And as you know, the core of her argument is that what makes people wholehearted, as she puts it, is being in touch with and owning their vulnerabilities. That's, she writes a lot, but in the end, it boils down to that incredibly simple message. You have to kind of be aware of and own your vulnerability, and then that's the kind of. Do you sign up to that?
I do. I fully sign up to her. I haven't read her book, but I saw her TED Talk, which I thought was
her
brilliant.
RSA talk was better, actually.
Was it? I bet it was.
No.
Yeah, she seems like a great person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thought is, someone said to me, there will be things in our lives about ourselves that will change entirely, and there'll be things about ourselves that never change at all. The problem is we don't know till the day we die which is which. And there was bits of that in what you said. Is there any way for us to be able to know what is that could change in ourselves and what it is? Because I get there are things about me that are still the same. I assume when I was 18 I would have got rid of my obsession with football, for example, or something else. But there are other things about me, for better or for worse, that have changed radically. Is there any way of predicting this to you?
I don't think so. Football goes pretty deep. Yeah. But if you write to Sugar about this problem, I'll help you, I promise.
Okay, that's great. So, who wants to share a point or ask a question or anything? Let's start with the guy at the back of the room.
Fellow, what a fantastic talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess it'd be interesting to hear your advice for the world at the moment in regards to, say, politicians and leadership. We spend our lives going to MBA school, listening to politicians talk about austerity and almost like a sort of a struggle that we have to go through. What advice do you have for Mr. Cameron, I guess your own country at the moment, in regards to leadership and I guess instilling a sense of hope for the next generation and so forth?
We're not asking you to comment on British fiscal policy.
Last night at my signing, I was at West Street in a bookshop, and I did a signing, one of the men who was having his book signed said, "Obama has shut your country down." And I said, "No, it's the Republicans, who have done that." And then we had this political argument. But, I think, honestly, my advice, when I think about politicians and, what's wrong with the world or what's wrong with the way I think that they so often approach their work is they lose that piece that I'm talking about as Sugar and Brené Brown talks about is vulnerability and acting out of, that commencement address I read, it has to do with living out your passions, living out your truth, doing what you love to do. And, when you do that from a place, of real, of actual truth, you can't help but bring something good into the world. And so I think so many of our politicians genuinely began from that place. They began from the place of feeling, and that's it. I think we all criticize politicians a lot. I think many of them are really good people who had good intentions originally. And then somewhere along the way, all of these other things started to matter more than their original goals, and desires. And so I would say, maybe all those guys should go on a weekend retreat with me and Brené Brown or something.
There are politicians who I think transcend this. My favourite politician at the moment is a guy called Mick Cornett, who's the mayor of Oklahoma. And the reason I love him is because what he did in 2007 on New Year's Eve, he held a press conference, didn't tell his advisors or anybody, he held a press conference outside the elephant cage at Oklahoma Zoo. And in his press conference, he said, I've been trying to lose weight for a year because I'm overweight. And he said, I'm failing. And so I want the people of Oklahoma to help me. So can we all go on a diet? And they did.
Yeah.
They did. They lost 1 million pounds in weight.
Yeah.
And what I like about that story is that, he kind of was part of it. He said, look, I can't do this. Let's try and do it. Let's try. They could have laughed at him, And there's no, I suppose this is what you do when you write a book and you give it to your readers. There's no more courageous thing than to say, I can't do this without you.
Right.
But generally politicians tell us the reverse. Generally politicians say to us, don't worry, it's sorted.
When I think too that piece, I've learned this over and over again, and when I teach writing, this comes up a lot because people are terrified to tell the truth about themselves. And the reason for that is we think we'll be judged, we think we'll be condemned, mocked, whatever it is. And I'm here to tell you that the reverse happens. When you stand before the city and say, I want to lose weight and I can't and I need your help, people don't make fun of you, they have sympathy for you because they have that same problem, And so the same is true in pretty much everything I've written about in any of my work. I might get a couple of nasty emails, but I get, in comparison, thousands of other emails that say, thank you, I have that same feeling, or I have that same experience.
Who's next? Oh, great. Back of the room first, yeah.
Hi, my name's Carrie Supple, and I love what you write, I love what you say and how you help all of us. And I just wondered whether in America or anywhere people have ever worked with you in order to try and systematize what you do, or say try and translate your thinking in schools so that the founding principles of be kind and find love and all the things you said. Are you asked to do that ever, to work with institutions?
Yeah, a lot of therapists and psychologists have taken up Tiny Beautiful Things, which is the book in which my Dear Sugar columns are collected. It's not all of the columns, it's a selection of them. Many, many people have used it in their practice, which I find just so deeply flattering and amazing. But no, I'm just a writer, there's never been any, I've never tried to bring that into another realm. I sort of put my writing into the world and then leave it to others to do that. But it is really interesting. So many therapists have come to my events and said, psychologists, psychiatrists, everyone working in essentially, mental health and wellness, they come to me and they say, I read your columns out loud to my clients because you can say what I can't say. And really that they're legally bound. There are certain boundaries. There are ways in which, as Sugar, as you saw in this column I just read to you, I tell stories from my own life by way of answering questions often, and there's usually a professional boundary, that a therapist has to face. And so I love that it's useful in that way. It's actually useful in the world. Thank you for your kind words.
There's somebody else here, but just before I turn to you, sir, in terms of systems, I mean, I read a statistic. You know, sometimes you're just reading something and there's a statistic and you're about to glide over it, and then you come back to it and you just stare at it. So I read this statistic that said that, this is about Wales actually, but I don't think the figures are much better for the United Kingdom as a whole, that only 35% of children say they enjoy school. So I read it and I moved on. I thought, hang on, that's 1 in 3 children actually enjoy this thing which is supposed to be opening up the world to them. Do you get passionate about education and what we do to kids?
I do. I have 2 kids of my own. I mean, I've always been passionate about education, but it is really complex once they're your own kids and you're sending them off to this place. And yeah, it's very, I mean, that's a whole other, you guys are going to have to invite me back and we can talk about education. But I do. I mean, it's a real...
So one of the ways I put this sometimes is that I say to parents, when I speak occasionally, you know, deep down, if I said to you what matters most to you about your child, you'd say you want your child to enjoy themselves, to fully express themselves,
Right.
to leave school loving to learn.
Yeah.
But if I then said to you, okay, you can have all that, but they're going to get 2 grades less than they would have got if they had a pretty miserable time and they just focused on their exams, what would you actually choose to do? And how would you judge the school? In the end, we judge it by the grades, we judge it by that narrower criteria. So I'm interested,
You know what?
How do you manage that?
I think I wouldn't. I really, truly, you know, I'm so anti-homework, for example. You know, the kids, I don't know what's happening here, but in the United States, more and more homework is being piled on. You know, and I just feel like, okay, my kid has been there all day. You know, they're not going to then come home and do homework. We're going to go hiking, or we're going to go play basketball, or we're going to play, you know, Risk or Monopoly or checkers or whatever. And there are other ways, you know, we all want to learn in all these different ways. And so, you know, I really do not buy into, I know a lot of Americans absolutely do, this sort of achievement, you know, this, I mean, I think you heard it when I say, you know, you know, I do think that there are all these ways of succeeding for which we do not have an accurate measurement. Money is not the accurate measurement of success in my mind, nor is that, you know, that grade, that top grade, or getting into some, you know, prestigious school. It doesn't matter to me.
Great.
I look forward to reading your book. I just got it. I just wanted to share something with you that was written by somebody who spoke here a few weeks ago, Clayton Christensen from Harvard University. Basically, to summarize briefly, what he was saying to his students in his class at Harvard is that every year he noticed over a period of 5 to 20 years, every time there was the alumni reunion for his class, he noticed that less and less and less people were coming, and there were more and more disasters happening in the private relationships of his alumni associates, one of whom was Jeff Skilling from Enron, who ended in jail. So what Clayton said was, in his last class, what he does, he turns all the theories that they learned in business back on the class and asks those questions of the students themselves. So just distill it down to 3 points. The 3 points which he mentions are, as you mentioned, try to find something that you love. Okay, find your own way. Second thing is, make sure that you have really good quality relationships with the people that you love. And the third thing is, make sure you stay out of jail. If you can stay out of jail, that's the ethical, personal ethics that you have. Okay. And the last thing I want to say is, character is defined by who you are, not reputation and what others think.
Can I just clarify this staying out of jail thing? This is about not doing things that could get you in jail. It's not about just avoiding being caught.
No. What he means is, by staying out of jail, you've got a line of personal ethics and moral responsibility to yourself, which means that no matter what happens in your life, your values are literally unshakable.
Okay, great. Any other kind of comments before we finish? Yeah, okay, one here and then one there, and then we'll take a final comment from you, Cheryl.
Hi, I read Wild last summer and I loved it.
Thank you.
When writing about your feelings and emotions while hiking the PCT, can you describe the process of what that was like? Because ultimately you're reliving some of the most ugly moments of your life, and you're also reliving one of the most beautiful moments of your life. So how hard was that in having to recount that? Did you feel like you were truly expressing everything that you felt in Wild? Or, I mean, how do you decide what was really important and what was needed to be drawn back a little?
And can I add to that, because I'm really interested in the film that's being made now. You'll obviously be involved in some sense in deciding what is essential, because the film is bound to play a little bit fast and loose with things and speed things up and slow things, whatever, films have to do that kind of stuff. So presumably you have to kind of think a bit about what is the really essential part of this story that I need to get across.
Right. Yeah. So to first talk about writing the book, and it was a very, it's the reason I really love writing is, especially writing about, when I write nonfiction, writing about actual experiences I've had, is you get to, you really do have to relive the experience, for better or worse. And, sometimes that means you have to, as you said, contemplate, and not just contemplate, recreate the saddest, hardest experiences of my life, no question. And also recreate and reconjure the most beautiful. And in the course of doing that, what happens is you understand it more deeply. Writing is very much like therapy. I mean, I do not write for therapy. I do not write for the catharsis, but it is a cathartic experience because, not that I've ever been through therapy, but, I understand the whole deal is like, so tell me about your mother. How did you feel when your mother said that? And you have to do this when you are writing. You're always examining every motivation, every situation. You're trying to remember and reimagine, what does this room feel like? What does it look like? What did it smell like? What did you see? All of those things that you're making, again, on the page. And so it allows you to understand yourself in a deeper way than maybe you'd have the opportunity to otherwise. And it's very complex because, of course, Wild is a memoir, which is a literary form, which is, I wrote about this moment in my life. It is not my life story. I could write a second memoir that took place in my 20s, and the hike on the PCT would be one paragraph in it. And there would be a bunch of other things I didn't tell you in Wild, And so I had to really decide what's necessary to this story I'm trying to tell. And I asked that same question when so Nick Hornby wrote the script, and it's brilliant and beautiful, like Nick is. But there were all of these questions I had to ask of the script. And was it, did he get the core, did he understand the core of the story I was trying to tell? And, he did, and he had to bring it to life in a different way through a different medium of the screenplay. And then the director will do that in another way, as, right now they're shooting, as we speak in Oregon. And Reese will have to do that. I told Reese Witherspoon, who's starring as me, and the director Jean-Marc Belly, who's a French-Canadian director, and I told them both, look, it's my book, don't worry about it. I made that book belongs to me, nobody can do anything to it. And what you need to do to make a great film is make it your film. You're not answering to me. You're making a beautiful piece of art. That's what I want that film to be. And to just really, you have to own it to make it, I think. And so that's what they're doing.
Great. And then I think finally, over here.
Thank you. Susan Reed, fellow of this.
Hello.
Hi. I'll stand up so I can see you to talk to. I wanted to thank you because, in a way, today is a real commencement for me. I've just come back from, I suppose, in a way, the dead, and had a very major operation. And so I made the effort to get here today to hear what you had to say, and I'm glad I did.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. It's funny, the minute I spied you there, I knew that you were special, you were in a special moment, and you look so beautiful in red.
Well, we rarely have speakers who refer to the audience as beautiful in red, but that's
I'm a flirt that way.
No,
yeah.
It's great. That's the nature of these new commencement events. This has been a fantastic conversation. Now, normally I have to kind of say the book's great, that you should get the book that's outside and that the author will sign it. But
Both
actually,
books, two books.
Both books. But as you'll see, we've planted people in the audience who have, I think on 3 occasions so far, said, I've read your book and it's fantastic and it's changed my life. So take their word for it. Get one or both of the books outside, and Cheryl will happily sign it for you, I'm sure.
Yes.
It's been a great conversation, so just remains for me to ask you to join me in thanking Cheryl Strayed.
Thank you.